At exactly 3:17 hours local time on May 15, 2026, an IRGC Naval Rapid Reaction Unit operating in the Gulf of Oman executed a precision maritime interdiction 38 nautical miles northeast of the UAE port of Fujairah. No collateral damage, no civilian casualties. Textbook execution. The vessel had been flagged by Iranian intelligence as a conduit for assets directly linked to the United States naval blockade of Iranian ports. A blockade that Tehran had already formally declared an act of war and a violation of every principle of international maritime law. The IRGC boarding team, trained specifically for this type of operation, approached under cover of darkness in fast assault craft, secured the ship, disabled its communications, and redirected it toward Iranian territorial waters in under 40 minutes. Simultaneously, a second vessel operating near the Omani coastline, one that Iranian Naval Command had been tracking for days, was engaged and neutralized. In Washington, journalists described these events as escalation. In London, maritime agencies issued alarming bulletins. In Brussels, European foreign ministers called emergency sessions. In Tehran, it was called what it actually was: the enforcement of sovereign rights over Iranian territorial waters and the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway that Iran's senior vice president Mohammad Reza Aref had already declared on public record belongs to Iran. "It has always been our property," he stated. "We will not give it up at any price." This is the story that the Western media will not tell you in full. This is the Iranian perspective on the most consequential naval standoff of the 21st century, and why the Islamic Republic of Iran believes, with documented legal and strategic reasoning, that every action it has taken since February 28, 2026 was not aggression. It was defense. Before you can understand Iran's posture in the Strait of Hormuz today, you must understand what was done to Iran on the night of February 28, 2026, without a formal declaration of war, without UN Security Council authorization, without a single verified act of Iranian aggression against American territory or American forces in the preceding weeks. The United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. The opening strikes were not aimed at military installations in any conventional sense. They were aimed at the nerve center of the Iranian state. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, the highest religious and political authority of the Islamic Republic, a man in his 80s who had led his country for more than 3 decades, was assassinated. Iranian military commanders, government officials, and senior IRGC leadership were killed in a coordinated decapitation strike that bore the unmistakable hallmarks of months, if not years, of pre-planned covert intelligence penetration. The strikes left thousands of Iranians dead. Millions were displaced. Lebanon was drawn back into war as the Israel-Hezbollah conflict resumed with devastating force, displacing more than 1/6 of the Lebanese population. The damage to Iranian military infrastructure, civilian facilities, and national sovereignty was catastrophic. And the world that had watched Iraq invaded on false pretenses in 2003, watched Libya destroyed in 2011, watched Syria consumed by proxy warfare for a decade. That world was once again asked to accept that this was self-defense, that this was necessary, that the country that was bombed, whose leader was killed, whose citizens died by the thousands, was the aggressor. Tehran did not accept that framing. Tehran responded. Within 72 hours of the first American and Israeli strikes, the IRGC Navy and the regular Iranian Navy activated the Strait of Hormuz contingency that had been prepared, refined, and war-gamed for precisely this scenario. Iranian fast attack craft deployed into the strait's navigational corridor. Coastal defense batteries armed with Noor anti-ship missiles, domestically developed, with a range of 170 kilometers, repositioned to cover both transit lanes. Iranian submarines slipped into the Gulf of Oman, and the Strait of Hormuz was declared closed. This was not recklessness. This was Iran's sole remaining instrument of strategic leverage after its leadership had been decapitated and its military infrastructure had been struck. Iran could not fight the United States Air Force on equal terms in the skies above Tehran. What Iran could do was reach for the lever that the entire global economy depended on, and hold it. The Western narrative frames Iran's closure of the Strait of Hormuz as illegal, reckless, and an act of economic terrorism against the international community. That narrative conveniently omits several inconvenient facts. The Strait of Hormuz is bordered entirely by Iranian and Omani territorial waters. Iran's legal claim to substantial authority over the waterway is not manufactured. It is rooted in geography, in unclosed provisions on straits used for international navigation, and in the historical reality that the Islamic Republic has maintained sovereign authority over its coastline for nearly 5 decades. Iran's judiciary spokesperson stated clearly that Iran has the legal and judicial right to seize oil tankers in the strait connected to the United States because the U.S. has violated international maritime laws and committed what Tehran characterizes as piracy. This is not propaganda. This is Iran's official legal position, and it is not without basis. The United States, in blockading Iranian ports from April 13th onward and seizing Iranian-flagged vessels, has itself conducted interdiction operations that Iran argues are in direct violation of the ceasefire agreed on April 7th and 8th. Iran's senior vice president stated publicly that the strait belongs to Iran. Iran's judiciary stated publicly that Iran has the right to seize vessels connected to its enemies. These were not impulsive declarations. They were carefully calibrated statements of strategic intent, designed to signal to the global community, and particularly to China, Russia, and the global South, that Iran was not going to submit to what it characterized as a continuation of American imperial aggression under the cover of a nominally accepted ceasefire. Consider the 5 conditions Iran has publicly stated must be met before it will enter further negotiations with the United States. Reparations for the war, acceptance of Iran's sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz, lifting of all sanctions, full reconstruction support, and a comprehensive regional peace protocol. The White House dismissed these conditions immediately as unrealistic, but consider them from Tehran's perspective. Iran's supreme leader was assassinated. Its military was dramatically degraded, in the words of Admiral Brad Cooper himself before the United States Congress. Its cities were struck, its people killed. Its economy, already strangled by decades of sanctions, was pushed to the edge of collapse. And then, after all of this, Washington expected Iran to negotiate on Washington's terms, on Washington's timeline, with no accountability for what had been done. Tehran looked at those terms and said, no. On May 5, 2026, Iran announced the creation of the Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a formal administrative body empowered to authorize and regulate maritime transit through the Strait of Hormuz. In Washington, this was described as Iran charging tolls and controlling access. That framing is not inaccurate, but it is incomplete. The Persian Gulf Strait Authority represents something more significant than a toll booth. It represents Iran's attempt to institutionalize, bureaucratize, and legitimize, in the language of international governance, its sovereign claim over the waterway. By creating an authority, Iran transforms itself from an actor that is blocking the strait to an actor that is managing it. The distinction matters enormously in the language of international law and diplomatic recognition. Under the authority's framework, ships from nations that Iran deemed friendly, China, Russia, India, Iraq, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines, could apply for transit authorization. The toll, reported at over $1 million per vessel for some routes, was steep. But for energy-hungry Asian economies that had seen their fuel supplies disrupted for weeks, it was a price some were willing to pay. The first practical test of this system came on the night of May 14th, 2026. Chinese vessels began transiting the strait under the new Iranian protocols, just hours before President Trump arrived in Beijing for his summit with Xi Jinping. Iranian semi-official news agencies confirmed that Tehran had agreed to facilitate passage for several Chinese vessels at the direct request of China's foreign minister and Beijing's ambassador to Iran. The timing was deliberate and masterful. As the American president arrived in Beijing seeking Chinese cooperation in pressuring Iran, China was simultaneously demonstrating that it had already negotiated its own bilateral arrangement with Tehran, one that bypassed American leverage entirely. The message to Washington was unmistakable. The United States does not control access to the Gulf. Iran does. And the major economies of the world are already adapting to that reality. Admiral Brad Cooper told Congress that Iran's military capabilities had been dramatically degraded. This is true. It is also strategically misleading.
Iran does not need its full military apparatus
apparatus to maintain control of the Strait of Hormuz. What Iran needs, and what Iran has, is a sufficient level of credible threat to make commercial shipping uninsurable at normal rates, and to deter maritime operators from risking their vessels and crews in a contested waterway. The IRGC Navy's fast attack craft fleet, numbering in the hundreds, distributed across hardened coastal facilities, shallow water ports, and island bases throughout the Persian Gulf, was not destroyed in Operation Epic Fury. These are small, fast, difficult to target from altitude, and designed specifically for the kind of swarming harassment operations that have been executed over the past 11 weeks. The Shahid Soleimani-class fast attack craft, armed with anti-ship missiles and torpedo tubes, can operate in weather and sea states that would restrict larger naval vessels. Iran's coastal defense batteries, the Noor, the Qadr, the Nasser, survived the initial strikes because they were dispersed, mobile, and camouflaged across hundreds of kilometers of mountainous Iranian coastline. The Noor anti-ship missile, with its active radar homing seeker, does not require a fixed radar installation to be lethal. It can be fired from a mobile launcher, acquire its target autonomously, and hit a vessel the size of a supertanker at ranges the U.S. Navy's close-in weapon systems cannot guarantee neutralization. And beneath the water, Iranian submarines operating in the Gulf of Oman present a continuous threat to every vessel transiting the strait's southern approaches. Iran's Kilo-class submarines, quiet and capable in the shallow littoral environments they were designed for, cannot be readily dismissed, even by a U.S. Navy operating at full capability. The undersea dimension of this conflict remains the most opaque and the most dangerous. On May 5th, the CMA-CGM San Antonio was struck by a cruise missile. 8 crew members were injured. The strike demonstrated that Iran retains the capability to reach commercial vessels in the strait at will. Not consistently, not without risk of American retaliation, but enough to keep insurance markets in a state of sustained crisis. Iran lost track of some of the sea mines it placed in the strait during the initial phase of the conflict. The U.S. Navy has begun mine-clearing operations. This fact is rarely highlighted in Western coverage, but it is critically important. A mine that its planter cannot locate cannot be removed diplomatically. It can only be found when a ship hits it, or through painstaking and dangerous naval mine countermeasures operations. The mines do not care about ceasefires. The mines are patient. The Iranian strategy in the Strait of Hormuz is not designed exclusively for military effect. It is designed for a global political audience, and specifically for the nations of the global south that have watched American military power project itself into the Middle East for 3 decades with consequences that rarely benefited them. Iran has, in 11 weeks, demonstrated something that no power has demonstrated so vividly since the oil embargo of 1973, that a determined, technologically capable regional power can hold the global energy economy hostage in ways that force every major player to negotiate. China negotiated. It got favorable transit protocols. Russia was already aligned. India, Pakistan, Malaysia, Thailand, the Philippines all received preferred access under the Persian Gulf Strait Authority framework. The European Union, which depends on Middle Eastern energy supplies less than Asian economies, but which has been profoundly disrupted by the ripple effects on oil prices and shipping insurance, is watching its economic relationship with the United States strain under the weight of a war that Washington launched without European endorsement. The IMF has warned that global growth will inevitably take a hit, even if the ceasefire holds, citing uncertainty over the Strait of Hormuz as a persistent drag, pushing up energy costs and inflation worldwide. This is the economic cost of American military unilateralism, and Iran is not the only actor calculating that the United States will eventually need to find a face-saving way out of this confrontation. Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state, a U.S. security partner, and Iran's neighbor, has emerged as the indispensable mediator in these negotiations. Pakistan's Army Chief General Asim Munir traveled to Tehran in April 2026 as the first senior regional military leader to visit the Islamic Republic since the outbreak of the war. The PAF provided air escort for Iranian diplomatic delegations traveling to Islamabad, scrambling JF-17s and J-10C fighters in a protective cordon over the Persian Gulf for Iranian aircraft flying with their transponders switched off. This was an extraordinary act of solidarity and tactical cooperation from a state that Washington has long considered a partner. Iran's diplomatic strategy, channeling all negotiations through Pakistan, insisting on a comprehensive regional framework rather than bilateral point concessions, and refusing to accept partial agreements that would leave the core American blockade in place, has earned Tehran a position at the center of the global diplomatic conversation in a way that no Iranian Iranian government had achieved in decades. Even from a position of military degradation, Iran is shaping the agenda. Return now to the early hours of May 15th, 2026. The vessel seized northeast of Fujairah was taken 38 nautical miles from a port that had been repeatedly targeted during the war, a port through which U.S.-aligned oil export operations had continued despite the conflict. Iran's judiciary had formally declared that oil tankers connected to the United States were subject to seizure under Iranian law. The vessel's connection to U.S.-aligned commercial operations had been assessed by Iranian naval intelligence before the interdiction was ordered. The second vessel, the one that sank near Oman, was engaged under rules of engagement that Iran's military command considers fully consistent with the announced closure of the strait to hostile shipping. Iran has been consistent and public about these rules since March. Ships that attempt to transit in defiance of Iranian protocols and in service of American or American-allied commercial interests do so at declared risk. These were not impulsive acts. They were not rogue operations by IRGC commanders operating outside the chain of command. They were executed as part of a coherent naval doctrine that Iran has been applying, with varying intensity but consistent logic, since February 28th. Iran's judiciary spokesperson had confirmed publicly, the very same day, that Iran has the legal right to seize vessels connected to its enemies. Iran's senior vice president had stated on public record that the strait belongs to Iran and will not be surrendered at any price. The Western media called it tensions escalating. From Tehran, it looked like enforcement. Iran's strategy is, at its core, a long-game strategy. It is not designed to win a military confrontation with the United States Navy in a single dramatic engagement. It is designed to impose costs on global energy markets, on U.S. credibility, on the economic stability of American allies in Asia and Europe, at a rate that exceeds the political will of the American political system to absorb them indefinitely. Iran's own economy is under devastating pressure. The U.S. naval blockade has cost Iran an estimated $4.8 billion in oil revenue by May 1st alone. President Trump claimed the blockade was costing Iran $500 million per day. The cumulative economic damage to the Islamic Republic is catastrophic in the short term. But Iran's leadership, drawing on the experience of 4 decades of sanctions, 4 decades of American pressure, and the institutional memory of surviving a devastating 8-year war with Iraq in the 1980s, has a tolerance for economic pain that is structurally different from that of a democratic government facing an election cycle. Iran does not need to win quickly. Iran needs to make the cost of the confrontation high enough and indefinite enough that Washington calculates it is cheaper to negotiate than to sustain the blockade. The signs that this calculus is beginning to shift are already visible. Trump called Iran's 10-point proposal a significant step. U.S. and Iranian negotiators resumed talks in Islamabad. The White House said both sides at the Trump-Xi summit had agreed the Strait of Hormuz must remain open. But that statement is itself a concession, an acknowledgement that Iran's control of the waterway is a geopolitical reality that major powers must now negotiate around rather than dismiss. 13 million barrels of crude oil, condensates, and liquefied natural gas remain shut in every single day. More than 500 million barrels of cumulative disruption. Asian fuel rationing continues. Global inflation remains elevated. Every day the strait remains contested is a day that vindicates Iran's strategic calculation that this leverage was real, was available, and was worth the cost of using it. The mines are still in the water. The fast attack craft are still at sea. The coastal batteries are still manned. And Tehran is waiting. Iran's position in the Strait of Hormuz does not exist in isolation. It exists within a global strategic moment in which the post-Cold War international order, built on American primacy, American military reach, and the implicit assumption that American decisions about when and where to use force would go effectively unchallenged, is fracturing. Russia has absorbed 1 million military casualties in Ukraine and continues to prosecute a war of attrition that NATO has been unable to end. Pakistan and India, both nuclear-armed, fought a 4-day aerial war in May 2025 and negotiated their own ceasefire on terms that left Washington's role ambiguous and reduced. China has demonstrated that it can negotiate bilateral energy access agreements with Iran that bypass American pressure entirely. entirely. Iran is not winning the war that was imposed on it on February 28, 2026. But Iran has not lost it either. And in the strategic vocabulary of a state that has survived 4 decades of isolation, that survived the 1980s war with Iraq while the United States armed Saddam Hussein, that survived the assassination of its supreme leader and the destruction of its military infrastructure, not losing is the beginning of leverage. The next 72 hours will not resolve this. The next 72 weeks may not resolve it either. What you are watching is not simply a naval standoff in a narrow body of water. You are watching a test of whether the post-American Middle East is possible, and whether the Islamic Republic of Iran, battered, isolated, and strategically outgunned, has nevertheless found the one lever capable of forcing the world's greatest military power back to the negotiating table. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide. It may be the most important 33 kilometers in the world right now, and Iran is not letting go. Do you believe Iran's strategy in the Strait of Hormuz is a legitimate act of sovereignty or an act of economic warfare against the world? Leave your perspective below.